Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome to day 3 of TMF week 2025. Everything to do about TMF evolution. What's new, what's going to happen, what are you going to need in order to get through um, these very trying times. So I just want to welcome you guys all to the second session of the day. And I just want to make sure that everyone can hear and see us. So if you can, just tell us where you're dialing in from, and let us know that you can see and hear us. So I see that there's a couple of people. There's one person from San Diego, New Jersey, Germany, France. We got some people from all around North America, Europe. Great to have you guys over here. So good morning, and I should say good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules, just to let you know that all sessions are going to be recorded and they're going to be made available at the end of the conference. I know this is a very, very popular question to ask, so we're getting it over now, letting you know that it's going to be recorded and it's going to be made available. So if you miss anything, don't worry, you'll be able to access it sometime next week. All attendees will be receiving a certificate of attendance. So if you attend one session or you attend all 20 sessions, you will get a certificate of attendance so you can show that beautiful certificate off on your LinkedIn page. So, let people brag a little bit that you went to the most popular TMF conference virtually in the world. And when it comes to questions, we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So, make sure to get those questions in. If you look to the right of your screen, that is your engagement panel. You can either write your questions in the Q&A section, and also, make sure that you get in your questions over to Mike and Gianna. And after every session, there will be a networking break so you guys can, mingle with each other, get to know each other. This is a community. We want to make sure that everyone comes together and be able to share ideas. And we really, really encourage you to, this is an interactive session, so we really encourage you to send in your questions and also go and meet each other along the way. On to the session timeline. So the presentation is going to be around 30 minutes. And we're going to do a Q&A portion for about 15. Then we'll intro the next session. And then it'll be time to have some fun and take a little break together. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Gianna and Mike. And they're going to be talking about safeguarding data integrity in the modern TMF ecosystem. So over to you guys.
Okay, thanks very much, Kim. All right, so click on sharing. Can everybody see the screen? Okay, great.
Yes, we could see.
Excellent. So hi, everyone. My name is Michael Zwetko. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at Montreal. I began my career over 20 years ago as a validation consultant, helping various life science organizations implement and validate numerous types of computerized systems throughout various stages of drug development and pharmaceutical manufacturing processes. In my current position here at Montreal, I'm responsible for overseeing the definition and the development of our SaaS applications, which include QMS, ETMF, and regulatory information management systems. And I'm here with my colleague, our Director of Compliance, Jana de Robertis, who I'll let introduce herself. Jana?
Good morning, everyone. My background is quite similar, or at least the beginning of my career was quite similar to Mike. We started working together at a validation consulting firm. My career started off doing validation of equipment in manufacturing in pharmaceutical facilities, and that has evolved over time. Today, my role here at Montreal as the Director of Compliance includes various responsibilities, but my main area of expertise still remains validation, specifically computer system validation.
Great. Thanks very much, Jenna. All right. So with that, during today's webinar, we'll be covering elements of risk-based data governance, and how the use of computerized systems can impact data integrity. So I'll be discussing concepts around management of the data lifecycle, as well as identification of key roles and responsibilities. And then Jenna's going to be doing a deeper dive into data integrity, including aspects of traceability, access and security, as well as usability. And then she'll be discussing concepts around management of computerized systems and the validation, as she mentioned. All right, so I'd like to begin by first touching on some basics in terms of the principles of data governance, since these are key, obviously, to safeguarding integrity of data. Building a robust data governance really starts by establishing all the policies and procedures that are needed to ensure the quality, usability, and compliance of all clinical data that are produced, collected, stored, and analyzed throughout a clinical trial. Now, as we all know, clinical trials today are supported by a wide variety of applications, and these applications support a large number of processes, managing large quantities of data that are produced throughout the various stages, which can obviously make the governance process quite daunting. Thankfully, there's quite a bit of guidance available, including the latest revision of the guideline for good clinical practice produced by the International Council for Harmonization, ICH E6R3, which will actually be coming into effect in the coming months. And this guideline has an entire section devoted to data governance, which provides clear guidance for the responsible parties, including sponsors and investigators, on how to implement appropriate data governance practices to ensure the integrity, traceability, and security of the data throughout the clinical trial process. So data governance also forms a very integral part of the quality management system. And the guideline recommends that we implement a quality by design approach, which helps us identify the critical data and the risks that can impact the reliability of the trial results. So effective data governance basically cannot be established without first understanding the data flow across the various people, processes, and technologies involved in the clinical trial. So as mentioned previously, this involves quite a few different entities. In terms of people, we have investigators, clinical research coordinators, clinical research associates. We have various processes, including record indexing, QC, site initiation, monitoring, and closeout, and numerous types of systems such as CTMS, EDC, eTMF, ePro, etc. So obviously, the quantity of people, processes, and systems is quite vast. And so, as I mentioned, the key here is to be able to map out the interaction that each of these entities has. And so one of the recommendations that we have is to start by actually drawing out the process. And here at Montreal, what we use is a notation called Business Process Modeling Notation, or BPMN, that helps us really understand each of the different actors and what they're going to be doing with at each of the stages of the process. So here we have an example where we have a records management process where an individual document owner creates a record, and then various decision points are taken, whether or not review is required, or if the record requires a QC or approval. And basically, we see the different actors and what steps they're taking at each stage of the process. And this is done for every single critical process that we want to manage. And this has a dual purpose to it. It also helps us communicate our system's behavior to end users, and those who are going to be responsible for verifying the design and the intended use of the application. So once this overarching data flow is understood, we can drill into each step of the data lifecycle. And again, in ICH E6, it provides some guidance for the various procedures that should be put in place for ensuring data integrity across the entirety of the data lifecycle, starting with data capture. which is where we define how data are initially collected and verified through the use of automated validation checks across the various types of systems, for example, ePro, EHR, EDC, or even wearables. Metadata management, which establishes the requirements for determining which metadata are critical to preserve the context and overall meaning and traceability of the raw data. Here we also typically is where we're implementing audit trails as required for the various critical data. The data review process, which is for reviewing the quality, consistency, and completeness of the data with emphasis on planned and risk-based review activities. Again, this is typically done with by leveraging the audit trail. And then finally, then corrections where, if necessary, we have to make sure that when we're changing data, that we're including proper justification and that these changes are attributable to the individual who's making the changes and that they're done in a contemporaneous manner. Data transfer and exchange guidelines for the secure and reliable transfer of data between the different systems, parties, and stages of the clinical trial. And then data finalization, including all the steps involved in preparing data for analysis and ensuring its readiness for regulatory submission. Data retention and access requirements for archiving trial data and metadata, making sure that they're retrievable for the required retention period. And finally, the destruction activities that need to be performed to ensure the secure disposal of data when it's no longer required. So equally important to identifying the data lifecycle is identifying all the critical roles and their respective responsibilities. And by assigning these roles and responsibilities from the outset, we can ensure that data governance practices are consistently applied throughout the data lifecycle. So again, as indicated in ICH GCP Principle 10, it's recommended that these roles and responsibilities be clearly documented. And that we establish ownership and accountability for each of the roles. Now, typically these are documented in the TMF plan, or it could be also documented in a separate governance plan and then cross-reference back to the governance plan. Each role should have a clear definition of their responsibilities and their decision-making authority. So generally speaking, we can identify each role as a data owner who's responsible for defining the policies and standards. They're ultimately accountable for the data integrity. And then we have data stewards, who are the ones who typically implement and enforce data governance policies. They actively monitor and measure and improve the data quality by identifying any data issues if anything should come up. Then we have data custodians, who typically manage the technical environment and ensure overall data security, backups, and reliability. And they also implement access controls. And then finally, we have the data consumers, who are the end users, typically of the data, using it for data analysis, reporting, decision making. And they really need to follow all the policies that have been established and report on any quality issues that may have been encountered. So obviously, these data governance requirements apply to both sponsors and investigators, who each have their own respective responsibilities. So going back to ICH again, some of the responsibilities for the sponsor include ensuring data integrity, confidentiality, and implying all the quality measures necessary for handling of data, safeguarding blinding and establishing unblinding procedures, providing very clear guidance to all stakeholders who are involved in the process, making sure that we implement protocols or procedures to help justify and document any changes that are required, ensuring timely access to data for the investigators while protecting blinding, maintaining all system records and ensuring validation, security, and end user management, developing analysis plans and ensuring quality control, and then finally retaining essential records as per regulatory requirements. So similarly, ICH describes the investigators having a critical role to play in ensuring data quality and integrity at the site level. And the investigator responsibilities for data governance include maintaining integrity of all data under their responsibility, ensuring they're following ALCOA principles for maintaining adequate source data records, performing timely review of data, making sure that sponsor systems are being used as specified, ensuring the accuracy, timeliness of data that's submitted to the sponsor, ensuring the reported data aligns with source records, safeguarding participant personal information, ensuring secure access to investigator systems, and finally retaining essential records for the required duration. So another aspect that's also important to consider that is sometimes overlooked is the shared responsibility that we have with IT service providers. So for instance, regulated entities might be contracting with an IT service provider for various services that are going to be provided throughout the clinical trial process, including data hosting, cloud computing, or platforms or infrastructure services. So under these circumstances, the IT service provider also has responsibilities to ensure that the authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality of clinical records and data are maintained. And so the regulations are clear on this, and there are several regulatory agencies who have already provided clear expectations in terms of what activities should be performed by the regulated user when leveraging these systems that are provided by suppliers. So, for instance, the EMA has issued guidance in their Annex 11 guidance, which talks about performing an assessment, a risk-based assessment, an audit of the supplier as necessary to evaluate their competence and reliability, and that we evaluate their obviously following best practices when it comes to development of the applications, and that they've implemented an adequate quality management system. And similarly, the FDA has shared their expectations within their guidance for industry, where they also talk about leveraging external parties for IT services, but ultimately indicating that the regulated entity remains responsible for ensuring that all regulatory requirements, for instance, those stipulated in Part 11, are met. And they provide a detailed description of the assessment criteria that should be used when evaluating IT service providers' suitability. And then finally, ICH E6 also touches on this topic in section 10.1, where they state that while the transfer or delegation of specific activities is possible, for example, if a sponsor leverages a CRO to perform trial-related activities, or if an investigator delegates their trial-related task, each one ultimately retains their overall responsibility for their respective activities. So as part of the governance strategy, the responsible party should maintain appropriate oversight to ensure that we're protecting the participants' rights, their safety, and the well-being and reliability of all trial data. We need to assess the suitability, as mentioned, of the service provider and ensure access to relevant information, for example, their SOPs, or performance metrics that are going to be evaluated as part of the selection of the supplier and as part of the oversight activities. It's also recommended to establish written agreements with the third parties to clearly define the roles, activities, and responsibilities that are required to maintain integrity. And depending on the types of services being outsourced, these agreements could include charters or service level agreements or quality agreements. For a detailed description of what a quality agreement should contain, I encourage you to refer to the article that was published in the Pharmaceutical Engineering magazine called Quality Agreements for SaaS Solutions Intended for GXP Use back in March and April of 2022. This was actually something that Jenna and I co-authored, and so we definitely have a lot to say on that topic. And I'll be handing now the floor to Jenna, who's going to do a much deeper dive into the whole concept of data integrity and management of computerized systems. So with that, Jenna, the floor is yours.
But not about quality agreements. Not today.
Yeah, not today.
So Mike did mention that one of the oversight responsibilities is to make sure that the rights of patients is protected, and so as well as their safety and well-being, and to assure the reliability of the results. This is just fundamental to GCPs, and that should be remembered throughout the data lifecycle. Basically, it boils down to data integrity, making sure that you can ensure the accuracy and completeness and the reliability of the data throughout the whole trial. One of the GCP principles is to make sure that the clinical trials are designed to generate reliable results. It's just fundamental. Otherwise, the whole process will break down. You need to ensure that the records and the metadata that are generated and maintained are accurate, complete, and they're, once again, reliable. We have to trust the data that is being generated. And for us to be able to do that, we need to follow the principles of ALCOA. ALCOA is the cornerstone of data integrity. Today won't be a lesson on ALCOA, but it is always good to remind ourselves that ALCOA has to be followed throughout our activities. And what is underpinning ALCOA is the concept of traceability. The first A in ALCOA is for attributable. Every piece of data and all the actions related to the data need to be traceable to its source. The source, that can be an original paper record, it could be a system or instrument output, or it could be a person. The original record, you need to know what that is, what the authoritative source is. The original record should be preserved, and if it's changed, we need to be able to make sure that the original record, the original data is not obscured. As an investigator, you need to consider and know where your authoritative source is. You need to understand what is the source record, whether it's the original document or a certified copy of it. The second A in the ALCOA is accurate. And so what that is telling us is that data changes need to be traceable. They also need to be justified and controlled. And as I said, if you're changing the data, you shouldn't obscure the original entry. Normally, you would justify and you would keep track of your changes, and you can do that through the use of an audit trail, for example. Through ALCOA as well, there's C for contemporaneous, which leads us to the concept of chronology. The entries or the data need to be traceable to the time of the event. The chronology or the timeline is really important for us because it allows us to reconstruct the whole sequence of events. And that's useful or necessary if ever we need to investigate any discrepancies in the data or any bias in the data. In the context of a TMF, if you're using an eTMF system, you should have a complete timeline to show the full chain of custody of the record. So this would be anything from who uploaded the document, who indexed it, how the document moved around, and what changes were made to the record. Traceability has to be maintained throughout the whole life cycle. There are different mechanisms or different artifacts that we can use to demonstrate traceability. It could be change control records, but one of the most useful tool is the audit trail. Effective data governance requires us to manage audit trails properly. In a computerized system, the audit trail would be automatically or system generated, and it includes a time-stamped record of all the actions that performed on electronic data. It's important to not disable the audit trail. Ideally, you would be using a system where it's not even possible to disable the audit trail. And you should also take action to make sure that the audit trail is not tampered with. Be sure that your audit trail is readily available and interpretable for review. You have to be able to make sense of the information that is captured in your audit trail. In fact, the FDA recommends that your audit trail be retained in a format that is searchable and sortable. And that's just to help you consume the information in the audit trail. But most importantly, the information has to be understandable. And this will be essential because it promotes transparency and it makes it possible to verify the integrity of the data, and it's also necessary for regulatory compliance. The audit trail is important because it's essential for tracking the history of the data, and it ensures accountability for the actions taken. Basically, the audit trail is there to help you provide information which helps you understand all of the actions that occurred on the data. And so basically, in other words, the audit trail is really a type of metadata. Metadata, broadly speaking, is just additional information that provides essential context about the data itself. And this can be anything from the date and time of entry, the identity of the user who created or entered or modified the data, any reasons for changing that data. It's just additional data about data. But it provides context that helps you understand and make your actual data meaningful. All data that is acquired during a clinical trial, regardless of its source, must be accompanied by relevant metadata, including audit trails. And the operative word here is relevant. What is relevant metadata? The regulation is not giving you that criteria. You need to decide that on your own. As an organization, you need to decide what metadata you consider to be part of the record and what metadata you don't. And you should have clear justification and criteria to support your decision. Trial-specific data, audit trails, and all of the relevant metadata should be reviewed. And this review should be a planned activity, not reactive. It should be a planned activity, which is just part of your oversight responsibilities. However, the extent and the nature of the review should be adapted based on risk and criticality of the data. Let's admit it, audit trails can generate massive volumes of data. Reviewing every single entry wouldn't be practical, and it's not even necessary. It could also overburden your resources. So realistically, regulatory agencies do now encourage a risk-based approach to the review. Rather than reviewing all of your audit trail entries exhaustively, you can prioritize what you do want to review based on a risk assessment. Your review should be adapted to the individual trial, your understanding of the trial, and it could even be adjusted based on your experience during the trial. The risk assessment should also consider the procedures that you have in place, the controls you have in place, and the actual system that we're talking about. Because all of that will influence your risk tolerance and the criticality that is presented on the data. Use your risk assessment to decide what you want to review, what you need to review, and even to define the frequency of the review. So for example, you can focus your audit trails related to critical data only. Maybe just test results and not the additional other data that has less risky or less critical to the trial outcome. You could also focus your audit trail on data that is generated at specific and more critical points in time, like specific approval steps, for example. You might want to also define the frequency of your review based on the risk assessment, focusing on higher risk systems, maybe doing a review maybe weekly or monthly, for example, whereas lower risk systems, you might want to reduce that frequency to an annual basis, perhaps even just through a periodic a review that is based on a sampling plan, or even just when exceptions are noted. It is important to review your audit trails and your metadata because this will help you verify the quality and the authenticity and the integrity of your data. But it's also an opportunity to help you identify where inappropriate changes were made to the data, and to actually even make sure that you have sufficient metadata and audit trails to support transparency. This is important to be able to ensure the trustworthiness of your data. It's not necessary to record every single keystroke in an audit trail, but it is important to make sure that you have the right amount of information in your audit trail. deliberate actions that users are taking to create, to modify, to delete electronic records, actions like saving or submitting, those are important and those should be captured. So verify that you have captured those in your audit trail, and verify that you actually have captured enough information to reconstruct the full sequence of events that demonstrate the integrity of the data. So, for example, if you're receiving a record from a clinical site, you might have QC'd it to make sure it respects ALCOA, but have you actually checked that you have sufficient metadata to understand what happened to that record? You received it. Do you understand the monitor's activity? Do you have enough trust that the record you received is actually the same record that was maintained at the site? Another critical part or activity to make sure that you are ensuring data integrity is protecting that data from unauthorized access and security breaches. Access controls and security controls are very, very important. You should have established procedures and processes in place to make sure only authorized individuals are given access to the electronic systems. You should define who should be allowed to view, to edit, and approve TMF records, making sure that it's only those authorized users, and that the activities and the logins are attributable to the individual. You can use your TMF plan to document who should have access and what they should have access to. This applies, the concept of security and access controls applies to the systems that you're using directly, but it also applies to your IT service providers for the system that they are delivering and managing on your behalf. Steps should be taken to prevent unauthorized access to the systems. So make sure you implement important controls, implement the adequate controls, especially to protect sensitive clinical trial information, and to prevent security breaches. There's a number of tactics and mechanisms that you can use, starting with just access controls and role-based permissions. Users should be given access only to the systems that they are required to have access to perform their assigned functions. And even within the system, once they gain access through the front door, you can further control their access through permissions, making sure that they're restricted from areas that they shouldn't have access to. So not everybody should have access to the administrative areas of the system. Only those who are deemed to be administrators, for example, should have access to those areas. When people are accessing a system, they should be logging into the system with user accounts that are attributable to their identity. Generic or shared accounts should be avoided at all costs because you lose the element of traceability to the individual. FDA doesn't really tell you what methods to use for access controls. For logging in, you can use multi-factor authentication. You can use, just strong login controls, or you can even use biometrics like facial recognition or fingerprints. That's up to you to decide what you think is suitable and the correct level for the protection that you're striving for. Your log information should never be shared. Your users need to be mindful of that. And you should also implement additional controls to make sure that your unauthorized access is averted. So for example, you can program your systems to automatically lock out or log out users after a period of idle time. Also through training and coaching, you can make sure that your users are mindful of locking their workstations when they leave their desk, which is especially important in high traffic areas. You should implement restrictions to protect sensitive information, and particularly pay special attention to access controls to protect the blinding of data. This is really important. You don't want to spoil that. You should implement security safeguards, such as anti-malware software to prevent any harm that may be introduced from the system itself. Other safeguards like encryption can also be used to ensure the confidentiality of the data. On your side, you should also consider using access logs or system-generated logs that will allow you to monitor the activity that is happening with login attempts, and any suspicious activity. This is really useful for you to be able to monitor, prevent, and detect any security breaches. The intent behind all of that, all these techniques that we're recommending, all of that is just to make sure that your data is safeguarded, that it's accessible. But the end game here, the end game of all of our data governance strategy is to make sure that your data remains accessible, searchable, and usable for the stakeholders. So you should use techniques that will facilitate the searchability and reporting. The techniques, be mindful of standardization and consistency. Use consistent document naming conventions. You might even want to work that through your procedures so that everyone knows and follows the naming conventions. You can categorize and organize your records, your trial records, using a standard approach and structure. The TMF reference model is highly recommended. And not only just following that, but also, making sure that your systems are designed to support that. We did talk about audit trails and metadata. So definitely using metadata tagging is something to consider, because that will make searching for your records a whole lot easier, and it'll make sure that your data is accessible more readily at the time when it is being requested. All of these techniques in today's TMF ecosystem are highly supported through computerized systems. So we need to also make sure that the systems we are using to collect, manage, and store the data during a clinical research activities are managed appropriately. There's high stakes involved, so we want to make sure that the systems are tightly controlled and adequately managed. The sponsors do maintain responsibility, so there should be adequate oversight throughout the clinical trial. And one of the main things, we talked about a whole bunch of activities that are managed through the system, but one of the things that is close to my heart is validation. Not because I adore it, but it's just my career path. So I do want to take some time to talk about validation of computerized systems. It is the responsible party, so either the sponsor or the investigator, that needs to be responsible for validation. And this can be a whole bunch of different activities, including user acceptance testing, that make up the validation. But the point here is that the system needs to be validated to ensure fitness for intended use, for its intended purpose in the context of the trial. The validation should cover standard functionality and also study-specific or protocol-specific configurations and customizations. So any customizations you've made for edit checks or calculations, for example. The standard functionality, might be covered by the vendor itself. So while the sponsor or the investigator is responsible for the validation, it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to do all of the work by themselves. When some validation is performed by the IT service provider or the vendor, the sponsor or the investigator who's deploying or using the electronic system should consider the option of reviewing the vendor's documentation. And that gives them an opportunity to evaluate whether the system is fit for purpose, and if the documentation is actually appropriate and to an acceptable level of detail, with an acceptable level of evidence, then there's an opportunity to leverage that documentation to reduce the validation burden. It implies cooperation between the vendor and the responsible party. I mean, you're assuming that the vendor will make the documentation available to you, but that's, it's totally justified for you to request that, especially through your vendor selection process, to make sure that the vendor will support you through that process. Wherever or whoever is doing the validation activity itself, it's important to maintain records of validation. Validation documentation are considered to be essential records. They need to be maintained and retained throughout the life cycle of the system, and they need to be available for inspection. Part of that validation needs to be filed within the TMF itself. And so that's something that we're hearing a lot of conversation about today in the industry. Which records do need to be in the eTMF? Which records can be stored elsewhere? Do you understand how your validation records are organized and where they're being maintained? Those are things that the responsible party needs to be mindful of. The validation activities can be very heavy and burdensome, but some of the burden can be alleviated by following a risk-based approach, always considering the intended use of the system. Focus the activities on and prioritize the areas of the system that are important for generating, collecting critical data. Consider what is the potential that the system will affect the well-being, rights, safety, and the safety of trial participants. Are there areas that could compromise that? Should the system fail to work correctly? Would there be a risk? And overall, is there a risk that the system will affect trial results? Where there's higher risk, that's where you should focus your priority. The other thing to remember is that the system validation should be carried out before you actually use the system. You want to do the validation work because that's how you're generating the confidence in the system, and that you have the confidence that the system will generate reliable records and data. You want to do that beforehand, not when it's too late. And on top of that, the validation is not a one-time task. It's not something you do once and then forget about it. You need to maintain that validated state. So it's important that you implement appropriate procedures for change management so that you are constantly evaluating any changes that are made throughout the system and upholding the validated state over time. This is especially important today when we're looking at a landscape where we're using cloud-based services. The cloud service providers will be making changes over time, and so you have to be on top of that, monitoring what's coming through from the vendor's pipeline. You should also periodically review the system overall the change records, and all the documentation that you've produced to sustain the validated state of the system. Validation alone is not enough for compliance. It's not just about testing and doing user acceptance testing. It's important to support all of that with proper controls. You need to establish procedural controls, which can be anything from documented policies, procedures, work instructions, whatever controlled process you have to make sure that the system is compliant, fit for purpose, and that it can be used to support the reliability of the trial results. These procedures should cover an array of topics, including data collection and data management, which would probably be rolled into your procedures for trial conduct. But you should also have defined procedures for proper use and maintenance of the system, including validation of the system. You should have procedures that address user access management, security management, even incident management. If there's a security breach, you need to have a process in place to be able to react to that, to address that, and to mitigate any issues that follow up because of the security incidents. Supporting processes also include defining your roles and responsibilities to make sure your personnel is accountable for their work, training the personnel, evaluating and selecting and managing your suppliers, and making sure that risk management is baked throughout all of your activities. These procedures are essential records. They need to be documented, they need to be retained in a controlled manner, and they need to be readily available in case you get requested for them by the regulatory authorities. Once you have the procedures, people need to be trained on those procedures. They need to be trained on not just the procedures, but just on overall how to perform their respective tasks. And this is linked to a GCP principle, which says that the clinical trials should be designed and conducted by qualified individuals. People are key to compliance. If they don't know what they're doing, you'll lose control, and the integrity of your data will suffer for that. So make sure that the people involved are qualified either through education, on-the-job experience, training, a combination of all of that. But they need to be qualified to perform their respective tasks. And it's not good enough to just say they're qualified. You need to demonstrate evidence that they're qualified, which means you need to maintain records of training. These are essential records that need to be maintained, and they also need to be readily available in case you get asked for them by the regulatory authorities. So overall, we have described to you the different elements of an effective data governance program. We hope that we were able to explain the framework or the elements of the framework sufficiently for you. But the key takeaway here is that an effective data governance strategy is essential. It'll allow you to properly manage the data, but it'll come and bring you additional benefits as well. Apart from the proper management of data, it'll certainly lead to inspection readiness. And ultimately, the net effect will be that there will be better adherence to the requirements and standards of the regulatory authorities, which just generally means that there's a reduced risk of non-compliance. And that's really a good thing. So we hope that we were able to enlighten you on the concepts of data governance. And we're now arriving at a question period. So please drop your questions in the chat.
Yes, please do. Thank you so much, Jana and Mike. It's a very insightful session. I know that we're running a little bit towards the end, so we're going to take maybe a couple of questions. And there have been a lot of questions that actually that came in. So I love the engagement. Love that everyone is really enthralled with the subject matter. I'm going to go with first question from Usman Ashraf. With regulators placing increased scrutiny on ALCOA plus principles, what are the most common vulnerabilities in TMF systems today that put data integrity at risk?
Okay. I'm going to go back to. It's a good question.
It is.
I kind of wish Steph was on this call, she would answer that question easily. I'm leaning towards, I'm going to turn to you, Mike, here, because you know about all the challenges we're having with the timeline and the audit trail. I'm thinking that that's a touchy point right now, making sure that the audit trail is capturing all of the events that are necessary to be tracked.
I think exactly. I think that given that we're dealing with a lot of different systems that are involved in the whole data lifecycle, like I mentioned, sometimes the data might be entering one system and then needs to transfer to another. So I would say probably one of the challenges is that integration, making sure that while you transfer the data, the raw data being transferred, you're also including elements of the metadata, which, as you mentioned, are key to be able to demonstrate the principles of ALCOA and are often, I think, left behind or not fully understood and what should be included. So I would say that's probably I'm not sure if I would term it as a vulnerability. It's probably more like a challenge, an area that is challenging when we're dealing with multiple systems that essentially need to be integrated. One of the, I think, good things that we're going to be having in the near future, I believe, is a standard in terms of metadata for the various types of records that are being generated, which will allow a more direct interchange of this type of information between the different types of systems. So when we have standardization, we can make sure that those systems are communicating the same information, and then that transits its way from the point where it's collected all the way to where the data will ultimately be archived.
Great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Mike. I'm going to try and see if we could do 2 more questions, but I'm going to go with Ronla Prince. AI has been always a big subject matter and something that's talked about. So she's saying any insights into how companies are using Gen AI to help with data integrity.
It's not just companies; it's the regulatory authorities too. The FDA, actually, I was just reading, has they were early in launching AI tools to actually even review the data. It really reduces the time taken to review the quality of the data and to dismiss invalid data. So, so it's definitely something to watch out for.
Yeah, I think there's definitely certain aspects we've worked with AI tools to help with certain repetitive tasks and QC type of activities where, you know, some errors might just be blatantly obvious. Where, for instance, you know, there's illegible pages that have been scanned into the system, or missing pages, or missing signatures, that type of thing. We were actually able to train the AI tool to look at those types of QC issues, which, again, if it's relying on an individual to do that, it can be missed. Obviously, depending on the size of the record being uploaded, it could be many, many pages. So these types of tools are very good at that type of, I would say, that type of supporting activity. We still obviously recommend having a person in the loop to oversee that process, but, you know, again, based on the confidence level that the AI tool usually produces as part of its process, it'll usually indicate, you know, what confidence level it has when it detects a certain issue, and also based on the risk of the record itself, you could, you know, fully either rely on the results of the AI tool or do a type of randomized check to make sure that, you know, it is obviously doing what it's supposed to do.
Okay. So, like, with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. I think we're coming to an end of the session. Thank you so much, Deanna and Mike, for your great introduction. Well, I would say great session, and your insights into data integrity. We're going to I just also want to say thank you to everyone that was in the session that provided questions. I know that we weren't able to get to every single question, but we will try and reach out to you at a later date, or you can always come together on LinkedIn and poke Gianna and Mike and ask your questions there. I just wanted to let you know that the next session is going to be starting in roughly about 8 minutes. So there's still time for you guys to like mingle a little bit in the lounge if you would like to do so. The next session will be robots versus risk, how AI is rewriting the TMF oversight rulebook. So please check in towards that.
So whoever asked a question about AI might be wanting to join this session.
Exactly. And I just wanted to let you know that it's time to like network. So go in, mingle, have a chat with your peers, and we'll see you in the next session. Again, thank you so much, Diana and Mike. Great presentation, and looking forward to the rest of TMF week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim.
Bye.
Thanks, Jenna.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.